There are moments a person never forgets. Not the large ones, not the ceremony, not the verdict, not the day the letter arrives. Those moments announce themselves. They arrive with gravity, with the machinery of consequence already visible. The moments that mark a life tend to be smaller than that. A door opening, a hand reaching out, a floor warm underfoot in the middle of a storm that was supposed to kill everything. 3 months before the storm, a man named Ezra Holt stood on a hillside above a valley and watched a 17-year-old girl dig a trench into the frozen earth and told her she was building a death trap. He was wrong about that. He would not understand how wrong until the night he stood at her door with his son unconscious in his arms and the cold at his back and no other shelter left in the world. Until his boots crossed her threshold and the warmth of the floor came up through his soles and into the bones of his feet, and he stood there, a man who had built half the structures in the valley with his own hands, understanding for the first time what a home could actually be. But that night was still 3 months away, and the story begins not at the door, but at the beginning. It begins, as so many things do in that valley, with a verdict. The valley had not yet chosen its cruelty for the season. It waited the way mountains wait, without patience, without impatience, simply with the absolute certainty of something that has outlasted everything that ever presumed to challenge it. The pines stood dark against a sky the color of old pewter. The creek had gone silent beneath its first skin of ice, and in the small timber hall at the center of the valley's only town, 5 men sat behind a long table and decided the fate of 2 women with the casual efficiency of men signing a receipt. Ilara Voss stood very still. She was 17 years old, though she had not felt 17 in some time. She had the kind of stillness that is not peace, but its opposite. The stillness of a person who has learned that movement costs something and who has already spent most of what she had. Her hands were at her sides. Her dark coat was clean because she had made it clean, had stayed up the night before with a damp cloth and a candle, because she understood that the world judges the poor for their poverty, and she had decided not to make it easy for them. Beside her, her mother Clara stood wrapped in a gray wool shawl that had once been blue. Clara Voss was 41 years old and looked, in certain lights, like a woman much older. The cough had done that. It lived in her chest the way a lodger lives in a house they don't own. Present at every meal, every quiet evening, every attempt at rest. It was a dry sound, a sound like paper tearing slowly, and it had become the constant grim percussion of their lives since Henrik had died. Henrik Voss, miner, Norwegian-born, a man with hands like river rock and a mind like a deep shaft, full of dark passages that opened if you followed them far enough, into something brilliant and unexpected. He had worked the copper claims in this valley for 11 years. He had understood the earth the way a musician understands sound, not as a surface to be struck, but as a medium that carries meaning through its very structure. The mine had taken him 8 months ago. A collapsed shaft, a Tuesday afternoon, and now his widow and his daughter stood in the town hall while Judge Aldous Crane read from a document in the measured tones of a man who had confused authority with wisdom for so long that the two had become indistinguishable to him. "The board has reviewed your situation," Crane said. He was a large man, soft in the middle, a watch chain that caught the lamplight each time he shifted, as though even his accessories had been designed to announce his importance. He did not say Mrs. Voss. He said Clara. The use of her first name was not accidental. It was a small, precise cruelty, the kind that costs the one who delivers it nothing and costs the one who receives it everything. With your current lack of means, you cannot remain on charter land. The cabin is needed for the new assayer. Across the room, in the back row of benches, a young man sat with his arms folded and the particular expression of someone waiting to see a prediction confirmed. Owen Marsh, 19 years old. His father owned the general store. He had the clean hands of a boy who had never broken ground and eyes that calculated everything. The price of flour, the weight of a silence, the precise value of another person's humiliation. Clara coughed. The sound filled the room the way smoke fills a room, spreading into every corner, touching every face. No one looked at her. "We are not without mercy," Crane continued, sliding a folded document across the table with the air of a man bestowing a great gift. "The board has deeded you a plot, 3 acres at the edge of the eastern slope. Yours, free and clear." Ilara took the paper. She did not look at Crane. She looked at the map pinned to the wall behind him and found the small, hatched square that represented their future. She knew that land. Everyone in the valley knew it. The Barrow, they called it. A steep north-facing slope of loose shale and stunted juniper, a place where nothing grew with any ambition. Its only feature of note was a narrow, dark opening in the rock face at its base, a fissure that the children called the bear's mouth, because something about its shape suggested a jaw that had forgotten how to close. It was not a gift. It was a sentence with a deed attached. They walked out into the cold. Ilara did not look back at the hall. She had already decided that looking back was a luxury she could not afford. But as she passed the last row of benches, she heard something. Barely a sound at all, more like the shape a sound leaves in the air after it has finished. "Your father mapped every inch of that hill." She stopped. The voice had come from the far end of the bench, where old Clem Daly sat with his hat pulled low and his eyes, apparently, closed. Clem was 65 years old and had spent 40 of those years underground. His knees had ended his mining career 3 winters ago, but he still appeared at every town meeting, silent and motionless, the way a fence post appears in a field. Noticed by no one, moved by nothing. Ilara turned. Clem's chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of sleep. His hat did not move. There was nothing to indicate that the words had come from him at all, except that there was no one else they could have come from. She stood with the deed in one hand and a question in the other. A question with no shape yet, no edges, nothing to hold on to. Then she turned and walked out into the cold to find her mother. The barrow was worse than she remembered. The path climbed through the last of the valley's timber and emerged onto an open slope of gray-brown scree that shifted and complained under every step. The wind had a direction here that it didn't have in the valley below. A constant, purposeful presence that pushed against them as though the hill itself were trying to discourage the approach. Ilara had Henrik's journal tucked inside her coat, pressed against her ribs, the leather cover warm from her body heat. The cave entrance, the bear's mouth, was perhaps 10 feet wide and 7 feet tall at its highest point, narrowing on both sides into dark wedges of shadow. Thorned brush had colonized the entrance, reaching inward like fingers trying to hold whatever darkness lived inside. Ilara pulled the branches back and stepped through. The air changed immediately. It was still and cool, and carried the scent of wet stone and something else, something older, mineral and faint, like the smell of a memory you can't quite name. The light from outside fell away quickly. The space extended perhaps 30 feet before the walls converged into a crack too narrow to enter. The floor was uneven, a scatter of fallen rock and compacted earth. And in the far corner, barely visible in the gray light from the entrance, was a boy. He was 8 years old, perhaps, thin in the way that means not enough food for too long. He was curled against the wall with a small, equally thin dog pressed against his side. A dog with no particular breed and no particular color, just the universal shape of a dog that has decided to survive and found someone to survive alongside. The dog raised its head when Alara entered. It did not growl. It simply watched her with the deep, patient attention of an animal that has learned to read people very quickly and act on what it reads. The boy opened his eyes. Clara came in behind Alara and stopped. She looked at the boy. She looked at the dog. She looked at her daughter. Then she did something Alara had not seen her do in 8 months. She crossed the cave, unrolled the blanket from her pack, and spread it on the stone floor without a word. Alara crouched down to the boy's level. He flinched slightly, the automatic flinch of a child accustomed to the wrong kind of attention from adults. She did not reach for him. "What's his name?" she asked, meaning the dog. The boy looked at the dog, then at her. "Rex," he said. His voice was barely there, a sound like a door opening on a hinge that needs oil. "Good name," Alara said. She sat down on the cave floor across from him, opened Henrik's journal across her knees, and did not look up for a long moment. Around them, the cave held its breath. The wind outside pressed against the entrance and could not enter. The dark was not threatening. It was simply dark. "Can we really live here?" the boy asked. Alara looked up. She looked at the walls. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the floor. The uneven, compacted, cold stone floor. She thought of her father. She thought of the mine shaft 200 feet down, and the warmth she had felt radiating from the walls like a slow, patient gift. She thought of his voice, low and lilting even when he spoke English, saying, "The surface is a liar, Alara. Down here, the earth tells the same story all year long." She closed the journal. "My father taught me," she said quietly, "that stone does not fight the cold." She placed her palm flat on the cave floor. "It remembers the warmth." She stood up. There was work to do. The first morning at the barrow began before the light did. Alara was awake when the darkness was still complete, lying on her bedroll with Henrik's journal open across her chest, not reading. She couldn't read in the dark. But holding it the way you hold something that belonged to someone you are not ready to stop believing in. Around her, the cave breathed. That was the only word for it. A faint, slow movement of air that she could feel against her face if she lay very still. A current traveling from the deep interior toward the entrance, as though the mountain were exhaling a long, patient breath into the pre-dawn cold. She had noticed it the night before, just before sleep. She had wet her finger and held it up in the dark, and the air had moved across her skin, cool, steady, directional. A cave that breathed had a temperature difference between its interior and exterior. A temperature difference meant something to work with, something to build on. Henrik's voice, from the journal, from memory, from somewhere in the rock around her. The mountain breathes in summer. In winter, a long, gentle slope can hold the warmth. The stone is a miser. It holds on to every degree. She sat up. She picked up the pickaxe. The plan was 40 feet long, and it began beneath her feet. The journal had taken her most of the previous evening to fully understand, reading by the small and miserly light of a single tallow candle that she measured in hours because she had only 3 left. Henrik's handwriting was precise and small. A miner's hand, trained to record observations in cramped conditions with limited paper. And his diagrams were dense with annotations she had to work through slowly, cross-referencing his terminology against her memory of the things he had explained to her underground when she was young. What she understood, by the time the candle had burned to its last quarter inch, was this. The cave was not simply a hole in the hillside, it was a thermal vessel. Its orientation, its depth, its natural ventilation, these were not accidents of geology. They were, her father had written in his careful angular script, the result of a specific formation that occurs once in perhaps every 100 such hillsides, and which I have been fortunate enough to find here. He had mapped the interior dimensions. He had calculated the grade of the floor, a gentle, almost imperceptible slope running from the back of the cave toward the entrance, and noted its thermal implications. He had described the stone itself, a formation of red sandstone layered with dark shale, materials he had cataloged in a separate entry as possessing excellent thermal retention and slow conductivity, ideal for sustained heating applications. He had not built this system. He had not lived to build it, but he had designed it in the language of a man who intended to return to the work. The design was a hippocaust, a word from the ancient world that Henrik had encountered in a book of Roman engineering and recognized immediately as a cousin of the underground heating systems he had observed in certain old mines. A firebox inside the cave, set into the wall, a long trench running beneath the floor, lined with flat stones, sealed with clay. The heat and smoke from the fire would travel the full 40 feet underground, surrendering warmth to the stone along the way, emerging from a distant chimney as little more than a cool wisp of spent air. The floor would become the radiator. The stone itself would hold the heat for hours after the fire burned down. And the air that Clara's lungs needed desperately, would be warm and dry and clean, because the smoke would never enter the room at all. It was not magic. It was physics. It was the patient, accumulated intelligence of a man who had spent 2 decades reading the earth and writing down what it told him. Ilara picked up the pickaxe and swung it into the floor. The impact rang through her arms and shoulders and up into the bones of her skull. She pulled the pick free, adjusted her grip, and swung again. The first inch took 20 minutes. By the 3rd morning, Owen Marsh came to look. He didn't come alone, which was the point. He came with 2 others his age, boys from the valley who had the particular energy of young men with nothing urgent to do and a strong preference for watching other people fail. They stood at the cave entrance and looked at the shallow trench that now ran 12 feet from the far wall, at the piles of excavated earth and broken stone, at Ilara waist deep in the dig, with her face striped with clay dust. "What in the world are you making?" one of the boys asked. He said it the way you'd ask about a child's drawing, amused, indulgent, certain that the answer wouldn't matter. "A hearth," Ilara said. She did not stop working. Owen looked at the trench. He looked at the cave walls. He looked at the journal lying open on a flat stone at the edge of the dig, weighed down against the draft by a piece of the red sandstone she'd been cutting through. "My father says your father had strange ideas," Owen said. It was not said cruelly, exactly. It was said in the tone of a person who considers himself a fair witness. Ilara drove the pickaxe into the earth. "Your father sells flour," she said. Owen's expression shifted. Not to anger, not yet. To something more complicated, something she didn't have the time to analyze. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked away with his companions, and she heard their voices dropping into that particular register of male amusement that means the conversation will be repeated later, with additions. She went back to work. Nate had found a piece of slate. He brought it to her on the fourth morning, holding it with both hands as though it were fragile, which it wasn't. Slate is among the more indestructible materials a child can carry. It was a flat, smooth piece, roughly the size of a book, gray-green, with a slight shimmer where the light caught it. "For my lessons," he said. Ilara set down the shovel. She looked at the piece of slate. She looked at the boy. He was still thin. He would be thin for some time. The body takes longer to recover from hunger than the mind does, in her experience. But something in his face had changed in 4 days. Some of the careful blankness had softened. He met her eyes when he spoke now, which he hadn't done in the beginning. She turned away before he could see her face do what it was doing. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. "We'll need chalk." "I found some," Nate said. He produced a small piece from his pocket. It was the color of old bone. She didn't trust herself to speak again for a moment. She picked up the shovel and drove it into the excavated earth, filling the wooden barrow they'd constructed from the lumber scraps. 8 years old, and in the middle of a survival situation he had not chosen and could not control, and he was thinking about his lessons. She thought of Henrik. She thought of the way he used to say, "What you carry in your mind, Ilara, no shaft collapse can take from you." Behind her, she heard Nate settle against the cave wall with his slate and begin drawing careful letters. She heard Rex settle beside him with a long, contented exhale. The specific sound of a dog that has decided its work for the moment is simply to be present and warm. From the entrance, Clara's voice, low, steady, singing something in the old language, not performing it, simply doing it the way you breathe. Ilara swung the pickaxe again, and the rhythm of it joined the singing, and the cave held them all. Ezra Holt came on the 5th day with good lumber and a good heart, and the absolute certainty of a man who has been right about construction for 20 years. He was perhaps 40 years old, lean through the shoulders, with hands that were the hands of someone who had spent 2 decades in direct negotiation with wood. He had built half the structures in the valley, the hall where the board had passed judgment, the church with its bell that the wind rang in November, the mill, 14 cabins that had stood through every winter the valley had produced without losing so much as a shingle. He arrived with a mule cart loaded with Douglas fir, straight-grained, seasoned, the kind of lumber that a carpenter saves for work he wants to last. He stood at the entrance of the cave and looked at the scene before him with the expression of a man trying to reconcile what he expected with what he is actually seeing. What he expected, 2 women in despair. What he saw, a girl waist deep in a 40-foot excavation, moving with the mechanical focus of someone who has stopped experiencing their body as a separate thing, and an older woman seated near the entrance mixing clay into a gray paste with hands that didn't shake, and a boy in the corner teaching himself to read with a piece of chalk and a flat stone, and a dog who watched Ezra's arrival with calm professional attention. "Miss Voss," he said, removing his hat. Ilara looked up. She waited. "I've brought enough here for a lean-to," Ezra said. His voice was careful and kind, the voice of a man who is about to do someone a favor and wants credit for it. "South-facing, set against the rock wall where you'll catch the sun. It won't be large, but it will be dry. I can put in a proper fireplace, stone and mortar. It will keep you and your mother and the boy alive through the winter." He paused. "No charge. It's the right thing to do." Ilara climbed out of the trench. She was covered in clay dust from collar to boot. She moved with the careful economy of a body that has been working at its limits for 5 days and has learned to spend itself precisely. She looked at the lumber on the cart. She looked at Ezra Holt. She saw a decent man. She saw a man who was correct about almost everything he believed. She saw a man who was wrong about this one thing in a way that could kill her mother, and she saw that there was no short path between where he stood and the understanding she needed him to have. "Thank you for the offer," she said, "but I won't build a lean-to." Ezra frowned, not with anger, with the specific frown of a man encountering resistance he considers uninformed. "The ground will take the heat, Miss Voss. A floor that sits directly on earth in a valley winter will pull warmth out of a room faster than any fire can replace it. Your mother—" He glanced at Clara, who had not looked up from her clay. "She needs consistent warmth. I've seen what cold does to compromised lungs. You need walls. You need elevation. I need 40 feet of stone-lined trench running beneath this floor," Ilara said, "which I'm building." The silence that followed was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, each with solid ground beneath their feet, each unable to see the other's footing. Ezra looked at the trench. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its professional certainty and found something gentler and more worried underneath it. "I knew a family," he said. "Over the ridge, 4 winters past. They tried to live in a cave, built their fire inside for warmth. By morning, all 3 were gone." He stopped. Something moved across his face, not just memory, but the specific weight of a body carried. "The child was 6 years old. I helped carry them out." Ilara heard this. She did not dismiss it. She did not defend against it. She stood with it for a moment in the way you stand with something real and heavy. Then she knelt beside the completed section of trench, struck a match, and lit a handful of dried juniper needles in the firebox opening. The smoke did not rise. It did not enter the room. It was pulled, with a low, resonant sound, almost a sigh, down into the stone-lined passage below, drawn toward the distant chimney by the temperature difference between the air inside the flue and the cold outside air. They watched it disappear into the earth. Ezra stared. "That's just a draft," he said, but his voice had changed. "It's not a draft. It's a draw. 40 feet of horizontal passage gives it more pull than any vertical chimney stack you've ever built. The smoke travels the full length of the flue before it exits. It surrenders its heat to the stone. The stone surrenders it to the room." She stood. "The floor becomes the hearth, Mr. Holt. The whole floor. Not just the wall beside the fireplace." He held her gaze. She saw him trying to find the fault in it, the place where the theory would break against practical reality, the way elegant theories usually did. She watched him not find it. "I'll leave the lumber," he said finally. His voice was quieter. in case you change your mind. I'll use it, she said, for the front wall. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded, not in agreement, but in the way a man nods when he has decided to allow a situation he doesn't fully endorse to proceed without his interference. He unhitched the lumber from the cart, stacked it neatly outside the cave entrance, and walked away down the slope without looking back. From inside, Clara watched him go. "He's a good man," she said. "Yes," Ilara agreed. She picked up the pickaxe. "He's wrong, but he's a good man." The kindness came from his sister. Della Holt was a widow herself, 4 years gone, a husband taken by the same kind of winter sickness that threatened Clara now. She appeared at the creek below the barrow on the 7th morning, standing on the far bank with a cloth bundle held in both hands, and the expression of someone who is doing something quickly before they can think themselves out of it. "Wool yarn," she said when Ilara reached the bank, "a tin of lard, some bread from this morning." She held the bundle out. "Ezra doesn't know I'm here. He wouldn't forbid it, but he wouldn't understand it yet." She said yet with a particular emphasis. The emphasis of a woman who knows her brother better than he knows himself. "Whatever you're building up there, I hope it works." Ilara took the bundle. She stood on the bank after Della had gone, holding it, and something inside her that she had kept very compressed and very still since the morning she'd taken that deed from Crane's hand shifted slightly. Not enough to feel like hope. Enough to feel like the thing that comes before hope, the thing that makes hope possible. She went back to the trench. Owen Marsh came in the dark. It was the 11th night. She knew this because she had been counting, the way you count things when counting is the only control you have. The chimney stack was nearly finished. 3 feet of carefully selected and fitted stone rising from the far end of the buried flue, each joint sealed with a clay mixture she had prepared according to Henrik's formula, each stone tested for thermal compatibility before being set. It had taken 2 full days. It was the most precise work she had done. She was asleep when it happened. Rex woke her, not with barking, but with that low, continuous vibration that means danger that is present but not yet immediate, danger that has not yet decided what it intends to do. By the time Ilara was at the entrance, the sound had stopped. She found it at dawn. The chimney stack was rubble, stones scattered, clay cracked and broken, the careful geometry of 2 days of labor reduced to a pile of debris, and in the soft ground beside it, boot prints pressed deep and clear. The boots of a young man who had been purchased in a specific store that was the only store in the valley. She stood before it for a long time. The trembling in her hands was not cold. Then she did something that cost her more than the rebuild. She walked into town. She entered the general store. Owen was behind the counter sorting nails, doing it with the practiced ease of a man on familiar ground. When the bell above the door rang and he saw her standing there, something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt, not quite defiance. A kind of bracing, the way a person braces for a blow they know they've earned. "I need wire," Ilara said. "Hinges. A half-pound of cut nails." Her voice was level. Her face was the face of someone who has decided that rage is a resource she cannot afford to spend here. "I'll clean your stockroom. 1 day's work." Owen blinked. He had prepared himself for accusation, for tears, for the public humiliating scene of being denounced by a girl in front of whoever happened to be browsing the dry goods. He had not prepared for commerce. "You don't have to," he started. "I'm buying supplies," she said. "The arrangement is fair." She cleaned his stockroom the following day. 8 hours of organizing and hauling and wiping down shelves that hadn't been properly attended to in longer than she wanted to think about. Owen stood behind the counter and watched her, and she could feel him watching. And she understood that her silence was doing something to him that words never could. Because words would have given him something to argue with, something to defend against. And her silence gave him nothing but the weight of his own actions sitting in the room between them. She never mentioned the chimney stack. She rebuilt it in 2 days. This time she buried it below grade, setting the stones in a trench dug below the surface, and covering the whole assembly with heavy rocks that no boot could dislodge without significant and obvious effort. She worked with a precision that was different from her earlier labor. Before, she had been building. Now she was also defending. Can you imagine that? Standing over the ruins of 2 days of work, knowing who did it, and choosing silence. What would you have done in her place? But what she didn't know yet was this. Owen had stood over the buried section of the flue before he kicked the chimney apart. He had felt the warmth rising through the soles of his boots even then. That gentle, impossible, underground warmth. And had destroyed the stack anyway. That knowledge would sit in him like a splinter for months, working its way deeper until the night it finally had to come out. The water came on the 16th day, and it came without warning. The pickaxe broke through a layer of compacted gravel and the sound changed. Not the dull thud of clay and rock, but a cleaner, almost liquid ring. And then the water was there, seeping up through the newly broken ground with the patient insistence of something that has been waiting under pressure for a long time. Within an hour, 2 inches of cold groundwater stood in the bottom of the trench. Ilara stared at it. The water was not deep. It was not a flood, but it was enough. Water in the flue channel would steal heat instead of holding it. The hot gases from the firebox would generate steam rather than conducting warmth into the stone, and the whole system, every inch of the 38 feet she had already completed, would be rendered useless. She sat down in the trench with her legs in the cold water and her hands on her knees, and for the first time since the morning she had read her father's design, she felt the architecture of her certainty begin to crack. She had accounted for the rock. She had accounted for the cold. She had accounted for Owen Marsh and his boots and his wounded pride. She had not accounted for this. Clara looked down from above. She said nothing. She could see the water. She could see her daughter's face. She had the wisdom to know that some moments require presence, not words. Nate watched from the edge without being asked to move, holding Rex by the collar, understanding without being told that this was not a moment for questions. The boy simply waited, the way he had learned to wait since long before he came to live in this cave, with his whole attention and without demanding anything of the waiting. That evening, Ilara opened the journal to the page she had been avoiding. Not avoiding consciously, but in the way you avoid a door you're not certain you want to open. It was near the back. The ink was smudged and blurred, as though something wet had fallen on it while the words were still fresh. She had looked at it before and been unable to read more than fragments. Now she tilted it toward the last of the evening light coming through the cave entrance angling the page so the low rays raked across the surface at a shallow angle, throwing the impressions of the pen strokes into faint relief against the texture of the paper. The words came up slowly, like faces surfacing from dark water. Grade the floor at 2 degrees. Water follows gravity, not hope. The seep will drain itself if you give it a path. Do not fight the water. Direct it. 2 degrees. The number chalked on the flat stone outside the cave entrance the morning they'd arrived. The number she'd understood as a mystery and filed away for later. It was not a mystery. It was an instruction. Henrik had designed the solution to this exact problem into the system from the beginning. And the person who had left those tools, that unknown hand with its particular sharpening technique, had known she would need the reminder. She set the journal down. She put her face in her hands, not to hide, not from weakness. From a tiredness so complete, it had dissolved the boundary between her body and her will. And the tears came because there was simply nothing left to hold them back. Clara came and sat beside her on the cold stone floor, and she did not offer comfort or false cheer or any of the things that would have required Ilara to perform gratitude she didn't have the energy for. She simply sat, and after a moment she put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they stayed like that in the dark. "Your father cried," Clara said quietly. "Every night after his shift. He would sit on the back step when he thought I wasn't watching, and put his face in his hands. Just like that." Ilara didn't speak. "But every morning," Clara said, "he went back in." She had not told Ilara everything yet. That would come later. There was a night ahead, much colder and much longer, during which the rest of the truth would finally find its way out. But for now, sitting on the floor of a half-built cave on a dark hillside with 2 inches of groundwater in a trench that represented everything they had, this was enough. She had not been wrong. Her father had not been wrong. The water was solvable. The path forward was there if she could find the angle. Ilara wiped her face, straightened her back, and picked up the journal. The regrading took 2 days. She reopened sealed sections, adjusted the grade of the entire trench floor to a consistent 2-degree slope, cut a narrow drainage channel along one edge to carry the seep water away from the flue stones and out through a small opening at the base of the front wall. It was brutal work, exhausting in a way that went beyond physical. And when she finished, the water drained. The trench floor was dry. The clay seals held. She tested the draw again with a handful of juniper needles. The smoke vanished into the earth like a secret. That was the evening that Clara finally told her. They were sitting at the small table, 2 boards across 2 crates, with the last decent candle burning between them and Rex asleep at Nate's feet, and the boy so deeply under that even the candle didn't touch him. Outside, the temperature had dropped to something that no longer announced itself as cold, but simply settled over the world as the new normal. He knew, Clara said. She wasn't looking at Ilara. She was looking at the candle. Your father, about his lungs. Not the accident. That was the accident, and it found him before he was ready. But the dust, the slow damage. He knew about that 4 years before the shaft came down. Ilara was very still. He came to me one night with his drawings. Clara's voice was low and even. The voice of a woman who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally found the right place to set it down. He said he had been thinking about a house, not a cabin, a house inside the earth, where the air would be warm and clean and the dust couldn't reach, where winter couldn't touch us. She paused. He said he had found the right place, the hill to the east, with a fissure in the rock. He said the stone was right. The grade was right. Everything was right. She looked up. Her eyes were steady in the candlelight. He wasn't building a home, Ilara, she said. He was keeping a promise he knew he might not live to keep. The cave was warm around them, not the warmth of a fire. The fire had burned down to coals 2 hours ago. But the warmth of the stone itself, radiating upward through the floor with the slow, constant generosity of something that has been storing heat for longer than anyone alive can remember. Ilara placed her palm flat on the floor. Warm, deep and steady and real. She thought of her father. She thought of his hands on the rock wall of the mine shaft, his expression going inward, the private smile of a man who sees what others don't. She thought of the journal, every diagram, every calculation, every annotation about thermal conductivity and airflow and the precise thermal properties of red sandstone and layered shale. She had read it as technical documentation. She understood now that it was something else entirely. The physics was the language. The message was older than physics. She closed her hand around the warm stone beneath her palm and held it. And across the table, Clara hummed the old melody, low and circular, the kind of song with no real beginning and no real end, simply existing the way warmth exists when you've learned how to hold it. Stone does not fight the cold, Ilara thought. It remembers the warmth. She looked at the sealed wall across the cave. The Douglas fir planks from Ezra Holt's cart, fitted into the cave mouth with careful joints and moss-packed gaps. The single small window she had traded Clara's silver locket to glaze. Their home. Theirs. Built from their own hands. Their own knowledge. The accumulated love of a man who had known he was running out of time, and had spent every remaining hour making sure the people he loved would be warm after he was gone. Tomorrow, she would light the first real fire. Tonight, she sat at the table with her mother and let the warmth rise through the floor, and outside the valley settled into its deep winter dark, and inside the cave, their home, their inheritance, the stone held everything it had been given. The first fire burned for 3 hours before the floor began to speak. Ilara had built it small and careful, a controlled thing, a few dry juniper branches in the firebox, nothing ambitious. She was not testing the system for comfort. She was testing it the way her father had tested every theory he held, methodically, with full attention, ready to be wrong. She sat cross-legged on the cave floor 3 feet from the firebox, and watched the smoke disappear into the earth with that low, resonant pull. And she listened to the sounds the stone made as it began to absorb what the fire was offering. There were sounds. She hadn't expected that. A faint ticking, almost inaudible, as the sandstone expanded incrementally against the clay seals. A deeper, slower settling. Not structural, she decided, not something to worry about, but the sound of thermal mass accepting energy the way dry ground accepts the first rain. Nate fell asleep before anything happened. He was curled on his bedroll with Rex pressed against his back, and the dog's eyes were open for a long time, watching Ilara, then watching the firebox, then closing with the same slow satisfaction with which the cave itself seemed to be settling. Clara did not sleep. She sat in her chair. The one Ezra Holt had left behind along with the lumber, a plain ladder-back thing that she had positioned near the entrance to the flue where she could feel the air quality. And she knitted. The click of her needles was the only sound in the cave besides the quiet labor of the fire. It was late when Alara felt it. She had been lying on her bedroll with her eyes open, listening to the darkness, when something changed beneath her. Not in the air. The air was still cool, still carrying the mineral smell of deep stone. What changed was the floor. The cold that had seemed to radiate upward from the earth with the relentless patience of something geological, something indifferent to human preference, had receded. She rolled onto her stomach and pressed her palm flat against the stone. Warmth. Faint, tentative, almost a question rather than a statement, but real. She moved her hand along the floor, following the buried path of the flue, and the warmth strengthened as she moved, not dramatically, not a fire's heat, but a deep, steady emanation, like the warmth of a living body under a blanket, like the warmth of the mine shaft, 200 feet down, when her father had turned off the lamp and told her to listen with her skin. She lay with her palm on the warm stone for a long time. Across the cave, Clara had stopped knitting. She was asleep in her chair, her head tilted back, her breathing slow and even, and Alara noted this with a precision that felt almost clinical because she had been monitoring it for weeks. Clear. No cough. No rattle. No paper-tearing sound that had become the background score of their life since Henrik died. Just breathing. Simple, unremarkable, human breathing. Ilara closed her eyes and pressed her cheek against the warm floor, and the relief that moved through her was so complete, so total, that it was almost indistinguishable from grief. They were the same shape, she was learning. Relief and grief. They both arrived at the end of something held for too long. The weeks that followed had a rhythm. Ilara woke before light, fed the fire, checked the seals, worked. Clara organized. The food stores, the bedrolls, the careful domestic architecture of a space that was becoming, incrementally and with great determination, a home. Nate learned. He moved through his lessons with a focus that she had come to recognize as his particular form of courage. The courage of a child who has lost everything and decided that knowledge is the one thing that cannot be taken away. Della Holt came 3 times that month. She never stayed long, and she never came through the front. She came to the creek or left things just inside the entrance when no one was looking. Wool. A small crockery jar of rendered fat. Once a book of arithmetic problems with a note tucked inside. For the boy. Ezra doesn't know I have a spare. Rex had claimed the corner beside the firebox as his permanent territory. He lay there each evening with the philosophical contentment of an animal that has solved the central problem of its existence: warmth, companionship, regular meals, and considers the rest of the world's complications to be other people's business. When Nate had nightmares, which still happened, Rex moved without being called, crossing the cave in the dark to press against the boy's side until the shaking stopped. It never took long. There is something about a warm animal in the dark that speaks to a part of the human brain older than language. Ezra Holt came back on a Tuesday. He came without the cart this time, and without the easy professional confidence he'd carried on his first visit. He stood at the entrance of the cave for a moment before Alara invited him in. She watched his face when his feet met the floor. He had taken 3 steps inside before he stopped. He looked down. He looked at Alara. He looked at the firebox. The small, controlled fire, barely larger than what you'd need to heat a single pot. He looked at the floor again. He crouched slowly and pressed his palm against the stone. He didn't speak for a long time. "The whole floor," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "The whole floor," Elara agreed. Ezra stayed for 2 hours that afternoon. They sat at the small table with Henrik's journal open between them, and Elara explained the system while Ezra listened, not with the listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but with the listening of a craftsman who has encountered something that reorders his understanding of his craft. He asked careful questions. He drew on the frost of the window glass with his finger. He was wrong about 2 things, and right about several others. And when they disagreed, he argued his position, and then, when she demonstrated hers, he conceded. At the end of it, he sat back and looked at the journal. "He designed this for her," he said, not asking, understanding. "He knew about the lung damage," Elara said. "He knew before the accident. He designed the whole system around what her lungs needed." Ezra was quiet. The fire made its small sounds. Outside, the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in late autumn, burning low and gold and brief. "I was wrong," he said, "about the lean-to. You were trying to help. I was trying to be right." He said it plainly, without self-pity, the admission of a man who has thought carefully about the difference. There's a distinction. After he left, Nate appeared at Elara's elbow. He watched Ezra's figure descend the slope below, growing smaller against the valley floor. "He looked at you different this time," Nate said. "Different how?" Nate considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Like you were real," he said. But the cave had not been forgotten by Judge Aldous Crane. He came on a morning when the sky was the color of tin, with a narrow-shouldered man carrying a leather document case, the careful posture of someone whose authority is institutional rather than personal. Crane did not come inside. He stood at the entrance and announced, in the measured cadence of a man who has rehearsed his words, that the county had a responsibility to the welfare of minors residing within its jurisdiction. That Nathaniel, he used a full formal name that Nate had never told anyone, which meant Crane had been asking around, was a child without documented guardianship, and that the county orphanage maintained a place for exactly such children, warm, supervised, properly administered, for the child's welfare, he said, precisely as she had known he would say it, because it was the kind of thing men like Crane always said when they meant something else entirely. Rex had risen from his corner when Crane arrived. He stood now at Elara's side with no visible aggression, no barking, no display, but with a stillness that communicated to anyone paying attention that the situation was being monitored. Nate appeared behind Elara. She felt him before she saw him, the small warmth of him, the slight pressure of his hand finding hers. "Please." His voice was barely a sound. "Don't let them take me." Crane observed this with an expression of practiced neutrality. Elara looked at the judge. Beyond him, the narrow-shouldered inspector held his document case with the careful grip of a man whose authority lives entirely in paper. And above Crane's chest, that gold watch chain caught the pale light. The same small announcement it had always made, the same performance of consequence. She felt something in her chest that was not fear and was not rage, but was something that contained both, like a fire that has been built correctly and burns clean instead of smoking. "Nate," she said without taking her eyes off Crane, "go inside with Clara." She waited until she heard his footsteps behind her. Then she said, "I will have a legal response to this through the proper channels. You will hear from me, Judge Crane, not from my distress, from the law." She didn't know how yet. She had no lawyer, no money for one, no connection to anyone with standing in the county court. But she said it with the voice she had used in the trench. Steady, factual, not a performance of confidence, but confidence itself. The kind that comes not from certainty about the outcome, but from certainty about the effort. Crane looked at her for a moment. Then he and his companion walked away down the slope. Ilara stood at the entrance until they had gone. Then she turned and went inside, and she sat on the warm floor with her back against the stone wall, and Rex came and lay beside her with his head on her knee, and she put her hand on his back and felt his breathing, slow, even, warm. And she let the shaking happen privately, briefly, and then she stopped it. That night was the only night in the whole of their time on the Barrow that she thought about surrender. Not with any real intention. More the way you notice a door in a wall you hadn't seen before. Not because you intend to use it, but because now you know it's there, and knowledge of escape routes is its own kind of weight. She sat in the dark after Clara and Nate had slept, and she turned the situation over. What it would cost to comply, what it would cost not to. What Nate's face would look like being loaded onto a county cart. What her father's face would look like from wherever faces go. Rex put his head on her knee. She looked at him in the dark. His patience, his absolute absence of ambivalence, his fundamental refusal to consider the possibility that she might not be worth staying with. She did not open the door. She closed it and went back to work. If you have ever faced a night like that, when the only way forward looked like the wrong choice, and the only comfortable choice felt like surrender, you already know something about who Ilara Voss was. The warm day came without warning. That was the thing about it. The way it arrived with such apparent innocence, such uncomplicated generosity. Ilara stepped out of the cave into morning air that was simply startlingly mild. Not the relative mildness of a winter morning that hasn't fully committed yet. Mild the way spring is mild. Open-handed, unhurried, generous in a way that made you want to accept it without questions. The valley below was already responding. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys instead of driving hard against the cold. She could see figures in doorways and on porches, people who had been sealed inside for weeks, stepping out to receive this gift the season was apparently offering. Children appeared in the street. Someone had propped open the door of the general store. Ilara stood on the ledge above the cave entrance and breathed the mild air and felt something that was not quite comfort. It was in Henrik's journal. She had read it twice and filed it carefully. A note he had written in the margins of a page about atmospheric pressure, not a formal entry, more a thought caught in passing. When winter gives you an unexpected gift, it is gathering debt. The warm day before a hard storm is not a reprieve. It is the storm drawing breath. She went inside and read the entry again to be certain she was remembering it correctly. She was. The air smelled of metal. Not strongly. You had to be paying attention, and you had to have been told what to pay attention to. But it was there. A faint mineral edge beneath the mild warmth. the smell of pressure dropping, the smell of enormous quantities of cold air stacking up somewhere beyond the visible horizon. Rex had been pacing since before dawn. He moved between the entrance and the back of the cave in a circuit that had no destination and no pause, his nails clicking a rhythm against the stone floor that stopped only when Alara touched his back and resumed the moment she moved away. She made her decision. She went to every door in the valley. She started with the ones nearest the barrow and worked her way down into the town, and she knocked on each door with the same knock. 2 firm, unhurried impacts. And she said the same thing to every face that appeared. There is a severe storm coming. Before dark. I'd suggest you prepare now. Wood inside, livestock secured, windows sealed. Don't wait to see the sky change. The responses formed a spectrum. A woman near the mill looked at the mild sky, looked at Alara, and said nothing. Only nodded, the nod of someone who has decided to consider the information privately. The blacksmith, a large, quiet man named Harlan, who had never spoken to Alara but had also, notably, never spoken against her, looked at his forge and looked at the sky and said, "How long do we have?" She said she believed less than a day. He nodded and began moving fuel inside. The Reverend, a thin man with the permanent expression of someone who considers ambiguity a personal failing, said that the Lord controls the seasons, and that he would thank her not to spread alarm where the Lord had seen fit to send comfort. She thanked him for his time and moved on. At the Pratt house, a large man with a voice that carried 3 doors down came to the threshold. Gideon Pratt. He had the satisfied look of a man who considers good weather a personal vindication, as though the mild sky were confirming something he had long suspected about the natural order of things. He looked at the clear blue morning. He looked at Alara. "The cave girl," he said, not quite to her, not quite to anyone. It was the way you'd comment on a weather vane spinning in the wrong direction, mildly amused, not malicious enough to be cruel. Now afraid of sunshine. She said her piece anyway. He laughed and closed the door. Owen Marsh was stocking shelves when she pushed open the door of the general store. He looked up. Something in his face moved. Not warmth, not yet. But the complex register of a person managing several emotions that haven't yet sorted themselves into an order. "There's a storm coming," she said. "A bad one. Today." He looked out the window at the mild blue morning. "It doesn't look like—" "I know," she said. "It won't until it does. Seal your window frames. Get your father to higher ground if you can." She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. "The cave," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the shelves. "If it gets bad, would you—" "Yes," she said. She didn't wait to hear the rest of the question, because the answer was the same, regardless of how it was phrased. Yes. Judge Crane was last. He was on the steps of the hall with 2 other men from the board. And when she delivered her warning, he looked at the sky, looked at her, and said with the patient condescension of a man who has never once been wrong about anything, "The cave girl is afraid of sunshine." The men with him found this worth a smile. Ilara looked at Crane. She thought about Nate's hand finding hers in the dark. She thought about the document case and the county orphanage and the language of institutional mercy that means its precise opposite. "I hope I'm wrong," she said. She turned and walked up the slope toward home. She was not wrong. The sky changed in the late afternoon. It did not change gradually. It did not give the valley a gentle transition from mild to threatening, a polite warning, a visible gathering of clouds that reasonable people might act upon. It changed the way a door changes a room when it slams. Instantly, absolutely, the entire character of the world altered in a matter of minutes. The horizon to the northwest went dark, not the gray of ordinary storm clouds, dark in a way that had a different quality entirely, a density that swallowed the remaining daylight and turned the valley floor to shadow before the first wind arrived. That shadow was still traveling across the open ground below when the sound reached them. Ilara was at the cave entrance when it came. The wind arrived before the snow. It arrived as a pressure change she felt in her ears before she heard it, a physical sensation, like the world inhaling and then refusing to exhale. And then it was there, a full-body blow that staggered her against the doorframe and tore the breath from her mouth before she could draw it back. The temperature fell like a stone dropped from height. 15 degrees in the time it took her to get inside and brace the door. Then more. The thermometer she had made from a glass tube and a column of colored water, Henrik's design from an entry about mine safety monitoring, dropped past the markings she had scratched at intervals along the wood, past cold, past dangerous, into territory she didn't have markings for. The snow arrived not as falling but as horizontal. It did not descend. It drove, parallel to the ground, a solid mass of white that erased the entrance to the cave within seconds of beginning and reduced the visible world to a wall of movement and noise. The noise was the thing she had not been prepared for. She had heard winter storms. She had heard the wind work its way through the cracks of the cabin they had lost, heard it press against the walls with a constant and intimate pressure. This was not that. This was not wind as a natural phenomenon doing what natural phenomena do. This was something larger and less categorizable, a sustained roar that occupied every frequency at once, that ceased after a while to register as sound at all and became instead a new condition of existence. The air itself converted into something hostile, something that had decided the valley was not meant to contain living things, and was working methodically toward that conclusion. Inside the cave, the candle on the table burned without wavering. Ilara sat and watched it. The flame held its small, upright shape, steady, indifferent to the violence 3 feet away behind the wooden wall. The sealed planks did not rattle. The clay in the window frame did not creak. The floor beneath her was warm, steadily, deeply warm. The 40 feet of stone-lined passage below doing exactly what it had been designed to do, surrendering its stored heat to the room with the slow generosity of something that has no reason to hurry and every reason to last. Clara sat at the table with her hands folded. Her breathing was even. Nate had fallen asleep against Rex with a book open across his chest. He had been awake long enough to hear the storm begin and had looked at Ilara with a question in his face that she had answered by sitting down and opening the journal. And the quality of her calm. Not performed calm, not managed calm, but the real thing. The calm of someone who built the room they're sitting in and knows exactly how it was made. Had been enough. The mountain roared outside and could not enter. The mountain held everything it had been given. She fed 3 small branches into the firebox. The coals accepted them. The draw pulled the heat down into the earth. The floor would hold it for hours. Outside, in the darkness and the horizontal snow and the cold that had long since passed the threshold where it stops being weather and starts being a force with intentions, the valley was discovering what it had refused to be told. And then, through the roar of it, through the sound that had ceased to be sound, something else, a knock. She had been waiting for it, and she had not been waiting for it. Both things simultaneously, which is the exact quality of something you have prepared for intellectually, while some part of you still hoped would not be necessary. The knock came again, harder. Ilara looked at Clara. Clara looked at Ilara. In the corner, Rex raised his head. She crossed the cave. She put her hand on the door brace. She thought briefly of the last time someone had come to her door with authority and a document case and the language of welfare. She thought of Crane's watch chain catching the light. She lifted the brace. The door opened outward and the storm tried to enter with its whole body. A wall of cold and noise and driven snow that hit her face like a thrown handful of gravel. And in that doorway, barely visible against the white, was Ezra Holt. He was carrying Tobias. The boy was 6 years old, and he was unconscious, and his face had the terrible gray pallor of a child whose body has been working very hard at something it is losing. Ezra's arms were around him, and Ezra's face, the face of a man who had spent 20 years building structures against exactly this kind of cold, and had watched his structures fail, was a thing Ilara would remember for the rest of her life. Not the expression of a man who was wrong. Worse than that, the expression of a man who knew he was wrong, and who was holding the consequence of it in his arms. Behind him, barely visible, Della, with Ivy pressed against her side. Ilara stepped back. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." She did not say anything else. There was nothing else necessary. Ezra crossed the threshold. His boots met the floor, and she watched him feel it. The warmth rising through the soles, immediate, unmistakable. The warmth of a fire that was not in the room, coming from the earth itself. She watched his eyes change. She had imagined, in her darker moments, what this scene might feel like if it came, the vindication of it, the weight of being right lifting off her shoulders. She had imagined, if she was honest, saying something, not cruelly, but saying something. She said nothing. She took Tobias from his arms and carried the boy to the warmest corner, the place where the floor above the midpoint of the flue ran hottest, and she laid him gently down and covered him, and she said, "Clara." And her mother was already there, kneeling, her hands moving with the calm efficiency of a woman who has nursed a sick person through a long night, and knows exactly where to begin. Della came through the door with Ivy, and Rex, who had not moved from his corner through any of this, now crossed the cave and went to the children with the same purposeful calm with which he did everything, and pressed against Ivy's side. And the girl, who was shaking, put her arms around the dog and stopped shaking. Ezra stood in the center of the cave. He reached out and put his palm flat against the stone wall. The same wall he had touched on his first visit, testing, skeptical, looking for the flaw in the theory. The wall was warm. He held his hand there for a long time. Then he turned to Ilara, and in his face was everything that needed to be said, and neither of them said it, because the moment didn't need words. It needed warmth. It needed room. It needed the next knock on the door, and the one after that, and all the things that were coming through the storm toward the only light still burning in the valley. Outside, the wind screamed its ancient grievance against the mountain. The mountain did not answer. The mountain remembered. They came in ones and twos through the rest of that first terrible night. Each arrival followed the same pattern, a knock that was less a request than a last resort, the door opening onto a wall of cold and noise and a figure barely visible against the white, and then the moment Ilara had now seen 4 times, and would see 10 more before the storm was done. When a person's boots met the warm floor and their face did something involuntary, something that had nothing to do with pride or dignity or the careful social architecture of a small valley community, something that was simply the body recognizing, after hours of cold that had moved past discomfort into genuine threat, that it was going to survive. Owen Marsh arrived with his father just before midnight. Elder Marsh was 63 years old and had lived in this valley his entire life, and he came through the door with the shuffling, careful movement of a man whose body had been conducting a losing negotiation with the cold for several hours. His hands, when Owen helped him to the warmest section of floor, were white at the fingers and clumsy. Owen unwrapped his father's coat and then looked up and found Ilara watching from across the cave, and what passed across his face was not the complicated defensive thing she had seen in the store, not the careful calculation of a young man managing his self-image. It was simpler than that, and worse, and more human. It was the face of a 9-year-old boy who had heard his mother cough. "Thank you," he said. His voice was stripped of everything it usually carried. Ilara brought warm water, heated on the flat slate of the firebox, the method Henrik had described for gradual warming of cold-damaged extremities, and showed Owen how to apply it to his father's hands. Not too hot, not too fast. The body comes back to warmth the way it comes back to many things, slowly, in its own time, resentful of being rushed. Judge Crane was last. He came alone. That was the thing she noticed first. A man who moved through the world surrounded by the machinery of his authority, by board members and document cases and the institutional weight of the county behind him, arrived at her door alone in the storm with nothing but the cold at his back, and his hat pulled down, and his watch chain, she imagined, very still against his chest. He didn't knock. He stood in the entrance, visible only because the storm had paused for one strange, brief moment in its roaring, a held breath between gusts. And in that pause, she saw his silhouette against the lesser darkness outside. She opened the door wider. He stepped in. His boots met the floor. He stood very still. In the corner, Nate had woken. He sat up on his bedroll with Rex beside him, and he watched Crane the way children watch adults they have reason to fear, with a stillness that is not calm, but the thing children do instead of running when running isn't possible. Crane's eyes found the boy. They held there for a moment. Then Judge Aldous Crane, who had called a 17-year-old girl a fool and moved to take her child and delivered an eviction with the language of charity, lowered his head. Not a bow, not a performance. The small involuntary movement of a man's head when the weight on it becomes, briefly, too much to hold upright. Clara was beside Nate. She put her hand on the boy's shoulder and leaned close. Her voice carried across the quiet cave, low and intended only for him. The old words, the ones she had carried from a country half a world away. The ones that had no good translation, but meant, in their bones, stone does not fight the cold. It remembers the warmth. Nate looked at Crane. Then he looked at Clara. Then he nodded, as though something had been confirmed that he had already suspected. By the second day, the cave held 14 people. Ilara organized them the way her father had organized his work crews underground, by function, not by preference. The children together near the warmest section of floor, supervised by Della, who had a particular gift for managing small people in crisis. A calm, practical attention that asked nothing of them emotionally and simply provided what was needed. The adults distributed in a way that put the most cold damage near the firebox and left the able-bodied accessible to work. There was work. That was the thing people didn't understand about survival. It required constant management, constant small decisions, 100 minor acts of maintenance that stood between 14 people and the alternative. Ilara fed the firebox every 3 hours, small measured amounts, nothing wasteful. She checked the flue draw. She checked the window seal and the door frame for ice buildup that could compromise the joint. She inventoried the food and divided it with the precision of someone who has spent weeks calculating exactly what a body needs to function and what it can do without. Clara managed the sick. Tobias was the most serious. He lay in the warmest corner with Rex stationed nearby like a small, self-appointed sentinel, and his fever moved through the night in waves, rising until his breathing became the shallow, rapid sound that made Della's hand shake when she reached out to help, then subsiding enough to let the boy rest. Clara worked with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had nursed a husband through years of mine dust and understood that the body, given the right conditions, will fight for itself if you don't exhaust it with intervention. Warm water, clean cloth. A low, steady presence beside the child. She sang, not loudly, just a thread of sound, the old melody, the circular one that had no beginning and no end. It moved through the cave like the warmth moved through the floor, steady, ambient, reaching into corners without announcing itself. Della sat across from Clara on the second night, their positions mirroring each other across Tobias's sleeping form, and after a long while she reached out and took Clara's free hand. Clara did not stop singing. She held Della's hand and smoothed Tobias's hair and let the old words do what old words do when the new ones aren't sufficient. Carry meaning in their sound rather than their sense. Speak to the part of a person that was formed before language and still understand something deeper than it. Their eyes met over the sleeping child. Della's husband had died of cold. Clara's husband had died underground. These were not the same losses. But loss, Ilara had come to understand, has a grammar that crosses the specific, a structure of absence and rearrangement that people who have experienced it can read in each other without translation. Della squeezed Clara's hand. Clara squeezed back. Ivy did not speak for the whole of the first day. She sat against the wall with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and she watched everything that happened in the cave with eyes that were taking in information but not processing it. The specific, slightly unfocused gaze of a child whose system has received more than it can organize. Ilara had seen this before, innate in those first days. She knew what it required and what it did not require. It did not require being addressed. It did not require comfort that came with obligations attached, with the expectation of response. It required proximity. It required something warm. Nate understood this without being told. He had been watching Ivy for most of the morning with the quiet attention of a child who has been exactly where she is and has not forgotten what it felt like. In the early afternoon, he crossed the cave, sat down against the wall beside her, and after a moment he said to Rex, not to Ivy. She looks cold. Rex, who had been lying at Nate's side, looked at Ivy. Then he stood, turned twice in the small circle that dogs make before lying down, and settled against Ivy's side with the settled, final quality of an animal that has made a decision and will not be reconsidered. Ivy looked at the dog. Her arms came away from her knees. She put her hands into Rex's fur and held on, and the expression on her face was not happiness yet. Happiness was farther down the road, further than this storm. But it was the thing before happiness, the thing that clears the ground for it. "Is the storm going to eat us?" she said. Her voice was small and scratchy from disuse. Nate considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "No," he said. "Rex won't let it." The cave was very quiet for a moment. Owen, who was sitting 2 feet away with his back against the wall and his father asleep against his shoulder, turned his face toward the wall. His shoulders moved once. Della made a sound that was not quite a word. Clara stopped singing for exactly 3 seconds, then resumed. Ilara, from across the cave, watched all of this happen, and she thought about her father, who had designed this room for exactly the people who were in it. Not these specific people, not these specific faces, but people who needed warmth and clean air and a place where the cold could not reach them. He had built it for whoever needed it. That was, she thought, the thing about kindness built into structure rather than performed in moments. It did not require the giver to be present. It simply was. It simply held. Owen came to her after midnight on the second night. The cave was as quiet as 14 people in a small space can be. The particular layered silence of sleeping bodies breathing together, interrupted at intervals by a cough, a child's murmur, the small sounds Rex made in his own dreams. The fire had burned to its core of coals, and Ilara was feeding it, unhurried, when she became aware of Owen on the other side of the firebox. He had not slept. She could see that. His face had the worn, slightly transparent look of someone who has spent hours in close company with their own thoughts and found the experience costly. He didn't look at her directly. He looked at the coals. "I kicked apart your chimney stack," he said. The words arrived without preamble, without the setup of an apology, just the fact of it, stated as flatly as a man might state a measurement. She understood this as a form of honesty, the elaborate apology, the one with framing and context and appeals for understanding. That was the version that served the person giving it. This was the other kind. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The coals shifted. A small adjustment. A settling. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked. "You could have. You had every right to." She thought about how to answer this and found that she had several answers, and that the true one was simpler than all of them. Because shame is its own punishment, Owen, and you were already carrying it. I could see that from the first morning. He looked at her then. For the first time since he'd arrived, directly, without the management she was accustomed to from him, without the calculation. "I was angry," he said, "not at you, at the fact of you, that you didn't—" He stopped, tried again. "My whole life I've been useful. That was the thing, being useful. And you came up here with nothing, and you didn't need anything from anyone, and you were just doing it. And I couldn't stand that." What she said was, "You hauled your father up a hill in a blizzard on a sled you loaded yourself. Nobody asked you to." Owen looked at the coals. "That was the first honest thing I'd done in a while," he said. I know, she said. I could see that too. The silence that followed was a different kind than the silence before it. Not the silence of things unsaid, but of things said that have been received and are now simply resting between two people, neither of them required to do anything further with them. I'm sorry, he said. Simple, undecorated. She nodded. That was all that was needed. Clem Daly had chosen the same corner on arrival that he occupied at every town meeting. As though even in a cave in a storm, his body defaulted to its habitual position relative to the social geometry of the valley. He sat on the warm floor with his back against the stone wall and a cup of the thin tea Clara had prepared, and he watched everything with the patient attention of a man who has learned that observation is its own form of contribution. He waited until the second night to speak. Ilara was sitting at the small table with Henrik's journal open, not working, just keeping it company, the way you sit with something you love. When Clem crossed the cave and lowered himself, with the careful procedure of a man whose knees require negotiation, into the chair across from her, he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. The stone was small enough to fit in a closed fist. Red sandstone, the same formation she had cut through in the trench, the same material Henrik had noted in the journal as ideal for thermal applications. But this stone had been carried. The geological smoothness of fresh-cut stone was different from this. This was the smoothness of years, of a hand reaching into a pocket and closing around the same object in the same way, again and again, until the stone wore the ghost of the gesture into its surface. Clem set it on the table between them. He gave that to me, he said, the week before the shaft came down, pressed it into my hand after a shift and said. He paused, and something in his throat required attention before he could continue. He said, "Hold on to this, Clem. It's the future." I didn't understand what he meant. I've been carrying it 3 years trying to figure it out. He looked at Ilara. His eyes were very steady. I understand now, he said. He knew he might not make it to build what he'd designed. He knew someone would have to come after him. He was telling me to hold the idea of it, to keep faith with the possibility of it. He looked at the stone, then at her. You are the future he was talking about. You and what you've built here. Ilara picked up the stone. It was warm from his pocket. His body heat transferred into it over years of carrying. A human warmth laid over the stone's own deeper geological patience. She held it the way her father had held rock samples in the mine, turned it in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the grain of the surface, the particular density of a material that has spent millennia being exactly what it is without apology or modification. He knew what I'd find here, she said. Not a question. He mapped every inch of that hill, Clem said. He knew the stone. He knew the grade. He knew about the water seep and how to handle it. I saw him work through that in his notes one evening in the mine office, 4 winters before the accident. He paused. He was the finest reader of earth I ever worked beside, and he loved your mother like the ground loves the seed. Everything he understood about stone, everything he knew about warmth and how to hold it. He gave it to you, first in the journal, then in the work he left for you to finish. She set the stone down on the open page of the journal in the margin beside Henrik's diagram of the flue system, and it sat there as though it had always been meant to rest in exactly that place. Ezra found her at the table late on the 3rd night. Everyone else was sleeping. The cave had settled into the deep, warm quiet of a space that has been holding people for long enough that it has begun, in some way that resists precise description, to hold them, to carry the particular character of their presence in its air and stone and arrangement. He sat down across from her without asking, and looked at the journal open on the table. He looked at the stone sitting in the margin. He looked at the diagram, Henrik's precise rendering of the flue system, the grade notations, the thermal calculations in their careful columns. Then he picked up the pencil that Nate had left beside his arithmetic slate, and he drew on the journal's blank facing page. He drew without asking. That was the thing she would remember. He simply drew a wooden frame, properly jointed, the kind of structure he could build in his sleep, strong and exact and true. But instead of the conventional foundation running to the surface and stopping, he extended the frame downward into the ground, and along the base of it, he sketched the stone-lined passage she had built, the long horizontal run, the distant chimney, his craftsmanship, her physics. He drew for a while without speaking. She watched him work, and she saw in the movement of his hands what she recognized from her own hands in the trench. The particular focus of a person engaged with a problem that interests them at a cellular level, that speaks to something in them more fundamental than preference. He paused at one point and looked at a section he'd drawn, uncertain. He turned the journal slightly toward her. She saw the issue. The angle of the flue relative to the building's grade would reduce the draw. And she took the pencil from his hand without discussion and adjusted the line. He studied the adjustment, nodded, took the pencil back. They worked like that for an hour. Not in silence exactly. There were small sounds, the pencil moving, the occasional shift of position, the fire doing its quiet work. But without speech, because speech wasn't the medium this required. What it required was attention, and they were both capable of that. At some point, their hands met on the page. Neither of them moved away. Outside, the storm was doing something different, not less intense. The sound was still enormous, still that wall of existence roar that had long since ceased to register as weather and had become simply the nature of the world. But it had a quality now that it hadn't had before. A rhythm, something almost exhausted in it, the way a long argument has a rhythm in its final hours before one side finally runs out of things to say. "My wife," Ezra said. He stopped. "She's been gone 4 years." He stopped again, and she understood that he was not building to something, not constructing an argument, simply placing a fact in the room where she could see it. An act of candor from a man who used his hands for expression rather than his words, and who was finding, in this particular moment, that words were the better tool. "Henrik has been gone 8 months, Ilara said. It was not a symmetry. She didn't intend it as one. She intended it as the same thing he had offered, a fact placed in the room, honest and without decoration. He looked at her. She looked at him. The pencil lay on the journal between them, resting on the drawing they had made together, her lines and his lines, different training and different materials and the same fundamental purpose, until she thought about what Nate had said. He looked at you like you were real. She understood what he meant now. Not that she had been unreal before, but that there are people who look at you and see the category you occupy: girl, orphan, poor, inconvenient. And there are people who look at you and see the actual you, the specific you, the you that is not reducible to any of the categories. And the difference between those two kinds of looking is something the body recognizes before the mind does. His hand was warm over hers on the journal page. The storm breathed its exhausted rhythm outside. Inside, the floor held its warmth. The stone held what it had been given. The fire burned small and steady in its box, feeding the long underground passage, paying its heat into the earth, which paid it back into the room, which held it, hour after hour, against everything outside that wanted to take it away. Tobias's fever broke in the last hour before dawn. Clara felt it first. The change in the quality of the boy's skin under her hand, the shift from the dry burning that had lasted 2 days to something cooler, damper, the fever releasing its grip the way a fist releases when a person finally falls fully asleep. She looked at Ilara across the cave. Ilara looked back. No words. The cave was full of sleeping people, and the moment did not belong to words. It belonged to the particular quiet joy that has no performance in it. The joy of a thing feared not coming to pass, of a body doing what bodies are built to do when given what they need. Ivy, who had been sleeping pressed against Rex, opened her eyes as though she had felt it, as though the change in her brother's breathing had reached her through some channel that had nothing to do with ears. She looked at her brother. She looked at Clara. She looked at Rex, who raised his head and looked back at her with his permanent expression of patient certainty. "Is Tobias better?" she whispered. "Yes," Clara whispered back. "The dreams are over." Ivy put her face into Rex's fur. Her small shoulders rose and fell once with something that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh, but lived in the territory between them. 14 people, 1 cave, and a girl who had refused to stop digging when everyone told her she was digging her own grave. What would you have done? The cave held its warmth around them all. Outside, the storm began. Slowly, reluctantly, with the particular resistance of something that has committed fully to its purpose and does not easily abandon it, to diminish. The roar dropped in increments. The quality of the silence between gusts changed, lengthened, became something that could almost be called quiet. Almost. The valley was not done with winter. There was more cold coming, more difficulty, more of the long, hard work of surviving a season that did not concern itself with human preference. But this specific storm, this particular assault on everything that the valley's people had built and believed and assumed would hold, had spent itself against the mountain and found the mountain unmoved. Ilara sat at the table in the last darkness before dawn, her hand resting on Henrik's open journal, the red stone sitting in the margin of his diagram. The drawing she and Ezra had made together lay on the facing page, his lines and hers, the frame and the flue, the craft and the physics, everything it was possible to build when 2 people stopped insisting on doing it alone. Around her, 14 people breathed the clean, warm air of the cave her father had designed and her hands had built, and the floor held its warmth beneath them all, patient and constant and indifferent to anything the world outside had tried to take from it. She closed her eyes. She let the warmth rise through the floor and into her bones, and she stayed there, still and breathing. In her father's house, the storm released the valley the way a fist releases something it has held too long. Slowly, with reluctance, the pressure easing in increments before the fingers finally opened and the world fell back into its own shape. What that shape revealed was sobering. Ilara stood at the entrance of the cave on the morning the wind finally dropped and looked down at the valley below. The snow lay in sculpted drifts that bore no relation to the landscape beneath them. Great curved formations, strange and almost beautiful in the pale morning light, that had buried fences and reshaped the familiar geography into something foreign. The roof line of the general store was visible, the church steeple, but 3 structures at the valley's lower end were gone. Not damaged, gone, their outlines erased by the weight of what had fallen on them. The cold that remained was a different kind than the storm's cold. That had been violent. This was absolute, still and clear and merciless. The kind of cold that doesn't need to announce itself because it has already won. She stood in it for a long time. She was thinking about Gideon Pratt. He had been the loudest. Not the most powerful, that was Crane, and not the most complicated, that was Owen, but the loudest, the most consistent, the one who had come to the threshold with his big voice and his satisfied look and laughed at the mild sky and the girl who was afraid of sunshine. He had not come to the cave. She had knocked on his door like she'd knocked on every door, and he had found the whole thing funny. He had not come that night, or the second night, or the third. She learned why from Ezra, who had gone out on the morning of the second day to try to reach the lower valley and turned back when the snow reached his chest. He had seen the Pratt house from the ridge, or where the Pratt house had been. The roof had gone first, then the walls, then the chimney, which had stood longest, a single finger of stone pointing at the gray sky before the weight of accumulated snow took that too. Gideon Pratt had not made it to morning. His wife had reached a neighbor's house with the children, half frozen, her hands damaged in ways that would take months to heal. The neighbor's house had held because the neighbor had listened to his wife, who had listened to Ilara, who had knocked on the door and said what needed to be said. And this chain of small decisions between hearing and acting had drawn a line through the valley's population that the storm had then made permanent. Ilara stood in the cold outside the cave and felt the weight of this with a completeness that left no room for anything resembling satisfaction. She had been right. She had knocked on every door. She had said the words clearly and without drama, and some people had heard them and some people had not, and the ones who had not. Some of them had paid for it with everything they had. There was no vindication in that. There was only grief for the waste of it. She went back inside. The valley buried its dead quietly, in the way of communities that have survived something together and find themselves newly uncertain about the appropriate register for each emotion. The funerals were small and cold, and attended by people who were themselves still recovering, still counting what remained. Ilara attended. She stood at the edge of the gathering with her hands folded, and she said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more eloquently than she could manage. Judge Crane stood across the grave from her. Their eyes met once during the service. His face was not the face she had seen across the town hall table, the face of authority comfortable in its position, of a man who had confused the machinery of power with the machinery of justice for so long that the distinction had ceased to be accessible to him. That face was gone. What replaced it was something older and less defended, the face of a man who has been present for the consequences of his decisions, and has had several days of cold and proximity and a warm floor beneath his feet to think about what those decisions cost. She looked at him steadily. He looked away first. He came to the cave 4 days after the storm broke. He came on foot, hat in hand, actually hat in hand, the physical gesture of it, which she suspected cost him more than he would have liked. And he brought a document. He set it on the table without preamble, without the performance of generosity that had accompanied the first deed, without the watch chain catching the light at carefully managed intervals. It was a deed for 10 additional acres surrounding the barrow, signed by all 5 board members. In the margin, in Crane's own handwriting, she recognized it from the notice of eviction. 3 words, with the board's gratitude. It was not an apology. She did not expect one. Men like Crane did not traffic in apologies because apologies required acknowledging a position from which you had been wrong, and Crane's entire architecture of self required that such positions did not exist. But this, the deed, the acreage, the 3 words in the margin written in his own hand rather than dictated to a clerk, this was as close as he would ever come, and she understood that, and she accepted it in the same spirit. She signed the transfer document he had also brought. They did not shake hands. He turned to leave. At the entrance, he stopped. He was looking at the door frame, at the joints, the ceiling, the way the wooden wall met the stone of the cave mouth with an exactness that was not accidental. He stood there for a moment with his hat still in his hands. "Your father," he said. He stopped. He was not wrong about anything. She said nothing. Crane put his hat on and walked down the slope toward the valley, and she watched him until the distance took him, and she thought about what her father had written in the journal's last pages. The earth does not require validation. It simply continues to be true. The document arrived on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the storm. Ilara was at the firebox when she heard Nate's footsteps, running, which he rarely did inside the cave because running inside the cave had been established early on as a reliable way to knock things over. She looked up. He was holding a paper. His face had an expression she hadn't seen on him before, a kind of stunned brightness, like a person who has received news their body hasn't finished processing. Behind him, Della stood in the entrance with her coat still on, her face doing something careful and controlled that meant she was managing an emotion she had decided was not hers to express. Ilara took the paper. It was from the county, a formal document, the language of it dense with legal architecture, but the substance simple. Guardianship of the minor child Nathaniel, age 8, is hereby transferred to Ilara Voss, residing at the Barrow, said transfer effective immediately upon the signing of the attached affidavit. At the bottom, a signature. Crane's. No explanation, no accompanying letter, no justification or context or record of what had moved the judge to reverse a position he had stated with institutional certainty only weeks before. Simply the signature and the document, and the legal fact of it. Nate was looking at her. She looked at him, at this boy who had been in the corner of a cold cave when she arrived, thin and watchful and accustomed to being the least important person in any room. And she thought about the night he had taken her hand in the dark and said, "Please don't let them take me." And she had made a promise she hadn't yet known how to keep. She folded the document carefully and set it on the table beside Henrik's journal. Then she opened her arms. Nate crossed the cave in 3 steps, and she held him, and Rex, who had followed him from the sleeping area, sat beside them with his tail moving in the slow, satisfied arc of a dog that has concluded, after considerable observation, that matters are proceeding as they should. Della turned to face the entrance. Her shoulders moved once. She stood that way for a moment, looking out at the barrow and the valley below, and the pale winter sky that was finally, tentatively, offering something that resembled ordinary cold, rather than catastrophic cold. Then she turned back and put the kettle on. Spring came the way spring comes after hard winters. Not triumphantly, not with the easy generosity of a mild year, but carefully, testing each day before committing to it, advancing and retreating, warm afternoons followed by nights that still bit with serious intent. The snow retreated in stages. The creek found its voice again. The first green things appeared on the south-facing slopes, with the cautious persistence of life reasserting itself against reasonable doubt. The valley rebuilt. It rebuilt differently than it had been built before, which was not a thing anyone had planned or voted on or announced. It simply happened, the way changes happen when enough people have had the same experience and drawn the same conclusions. Ezra Holt rebuilt his house first, and he built it with a floor that was not a floor, but a radiator. Stone-lined passages running beneath it, a firebox at one end, a distant chimney at the other, the warmth distributed through the structure rather than concentrated in one roaring, wasteful fireplace that heated the ceiling while the floor froze. He called it the Voss method. He said this without ceremony, simply as a practical designation, a contractor describing his materials. But the name traveled. It went with the people who passed through the valley and stopped to ask about the buildings. The ones dug partially into hillsides, the ones with the small stone chimneys set away from the structures, the ones whose inhabitants answered the door in shirt sleeves in the middle of winter. Ilara did not think of it as her method. She thought of it as Henrik's method, completed. She thought of it as the thing her father had spent the last years of his life designing for the people he loved, finished by hands that had learned what they knew from his. She taught it to everyone who asked. She sat at the table in the cave, which was not only a cave anymore, but a structure with additions, a real door with glass windows, a terrace below the entrance where Clara grew things in the warmer months. And she opened the journal and showed people the diagrams, explained the principles, answered the questions. She did not charge for this. Henrik had not written the journal to be sold. Owen Marsh appeared at the entrance one morning in early spring with a set of surveying tools he had ordered from the county seat. He set them on the table and explained with the directness that had replaced his earlier calculations that he had some understanding of land measurement and that the 10 acres Crane had granted had never been formally surveyed. If she wanted clear legal boundaries, he could do the survey himself. No charge. She accepted. He spent 3 days on the barrow, moving through the snow with his instruments, and when he was done, he gave her a hand-drawn map with the boundaries precisely marked and the acreage noted in the corner. She added it to the table beside Henrik's journal and the guardianship document and the red stone, which had become, without anyone deciding this, the cave's particular altar, the place where important things were kept. He also, at some point during those 3 days, repaired the outer frame of the front door, which had developed a slight warp from the storm. He did this without mentioning it and without asking. She did not mention it either. Some debts are repaid in actions that are not described as repayment. This is, she had come to believe, the most honest form. The evening Ezra asked his question, the valley was doing what valleys do in the last light of a spring day, filling with color from the bottom up, the shadows going blue in the low places, while the high ridges still held gold. Clara was inside. Nate was at the creek with Rex, doing whatever Nate and Rex did at the creek, which appeared to involve a great deal of standing very still, followed by sudden movement, followed by Rex shaking water onto everything. Ezra had come to consult about a building question. A neighbor's structure needed evaluation, and the consultation had extended into the evening the way consultations did when the conversation moved from the professional to the adjacent to the personal. Each transition so gradual it was impossible to identify the moment it happened. They were sitting on the terrace ledge, looking at the valley below, when he said it. Not a speech. Not a construction of words that had been prepared in advance and carried up the hill for this purpose. Just a question, asked with the same directness he brought to structural problems, identifying what he wanted to know and asking it without embellishment. Will you let me stay? The valley was very quiet. The creek made its sound below, constant and unhurried. Somewhere on the slope, Rex barked once at something that had offended him. Elara looked at Ezra's profile against the fading light. She thought about the first time he had come up this hill with his cart of good lumber and his 20 years of certainty and his genuine, unhesitating willingness to help a person he had no particular reason to help. She thought about the table and the drawing and his hand on the warm stone wall. She thought about what it means to build something with another person, not just the physical thing, but the understanding required to make the lines meet, the willingness to adjust, to revise, to credit what the other person knows without diminishing what you know. Yes, she said. They were married in the cave because the cave was their home, and home was the right place. Clara wore the white dress from her wedding to Henrik, the one that had spent years in a cedar chest smelling of the old country, altered to fit the occasion and the passage of time. Nate stood beside Elara with his hair combed flat in a way that Rex had already investigated and found acceptable. Tobias and Ivy sat in the front, Tobias largely recovered, Ivy holding Rex's collar with the proprietary air of a girl who has decided the dog is hers and considers the matter settled. Della cried. She did this quietly and without apology, which was the right way. Clem Daly sat in his corner with his tea. The years that followed were ordinary years, which is to say, they were full. Nate grew. He grew the way children grow when they have been given time and warmth, and the particular kind of security that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that difficulty is survivable. Quickly at first, then steadily, the thin, watchful boy becoming a young man with his own kind of stillness, which was not the stillness of fear, but of attention. He read everything he could find. He asked questions that occasionally stumped Elara and regularly stumped his teachers, who had begun to arrive in the valley as it grew, and who found in Nate a student who treated learning as the most urgent thing in the world, which it was, because he had once been a child in a cave with nothing but a piece of chalk and a flat stone, and had understood even then what knowledge was worth. When he was old enough, he studied law. He studied it the way Elara had studied the journal, not for the prestige of it, but for the use of it, for the specific, practical application to specific, practical problems. He became the kind of lawyer who represented people who could not pay, which meant he was never wealthy and never seemed to notice. He took particular interest in children without documentation, in families displaced by circumstance, in the precise machinery of guardianship law and the ways it could be made to serve the people it was supposed to protect rather than the institutions that administered it. He kept the piece of chalk on his desk his entire life. People sometimes asked about it. He always told them. The cave remained the heart of things. Clara lived there until her last winter, which came many years after the doctors of the valley had predicted it would. The clean, warm air having done for her lungs what no medicine could have managed. The years returning to her one by one, as though the earth itself were paying back a debt. She tended the terrace garden through the long growing seasons. Potatoes, herbs, the small, tough mountain flowers that bloomed each spring with the particular stubbornness of things that have learned to endure. She sang the old songs while she worked, the circular ones without beginning or end, and sometimes in the evenings, when the valley went golden and still, Ilara would sit on the terrace beside her, and they would not need to speak at all. She died in her bed in the warmth of the cave, in early spring, with Ilara's hand in hers. Her breathing, at the end, was even. No cough. Just the slow, dignified withdrawal of a life that had been, in its conclusion, fully restored to itself. Ilara sat beside her for a long time afterward, in the warm quiet, her hand still holding her mother's. The fire was low. The floor was warm. Outside, the first light of the day was beginning to feel its way across the barrow's eastern face. She thought about her father. She thought about a man who had known he was running out of time and had spent every hour he had left making sure the people he loved would be warm. She thought about the journal, which was no longer just a technical document, but a kind of scripture. A text that had been read and lived and passed forward, copied in pieces into a dozen other notebooks by a dozen different people who were building their own versions of the thing he had imagined. Her father's promise kept. His knowledge alive. His love still warm in the floor beneath her feet. Rex died on a bright autumn morning, many years later, on the hillside above the cave. He had gone up there on his own, in the way of old animals who seem to understand what is approaching and prefer to meet it in the open air, in a place they have chosen. Nate found him lying on the warm side of a large piece of red sandstone. Henrik's stone, the formation, the same material that lined the flue below. He looked, Nate said, like a dog who had finished his work and found the finishing satisfactory. They buried him there. The grave was marked with a piece of the red sandstone set upright in the earth, uncarved. No name. The stone was enough. He would have understood. He had spent his whole life communicating clearly without words, and saw no reason to start requiring them after death. Clem Daly was gone by then. He had died in his corner, in the manner he would have chosen, with his tea still warm in his hands. The valley buried him on the hillside beside the cave, because that was where he had spent his last years, and the hillside seemed to have claimed him. The cave stood. Ilara grew old in it. She grew old the way people grow old when they have built something that outlasts the building of it, not diminished, but deepened. Her hair went white. Her hands, already marked by years of work, became the hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime in conversation with stone and wood and the patient physics of warmth. She moved more slowly, but she moved with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has never confused speed with purpose. The children she and Ezra had raised grew up and went out into the world and came back with their own children who ran through the cave and asked the questions children ask, about things they don't yet understand. Why is the floor warm? What's that chimney for? Why is this cave our home? And Alara would sit down with them, the way she had once sat down with Nate, at eye level, and she would place a small palm flat on the warm stone floor, and she would say what her father had taught her, what she had taught herself to believe on the floor of a cold cave when she was 17 years old, and there was nothing left but the choice to begin. The floor is warm, she would say, because your great-grandfather loved your grandmother before you were born. That is what warmth is. That is what it is for. And one by one, the children's faces would change. The shift from confusion to something quieter and more durable. The specific expression of a person who has just received something they will carry for the rest of their life without quite knowing they are carrying it. That was the thing about this knowledge. It did not announce itself. It traveled in stories, in the warmth underfoot, in the particular way a person builds their home when they understand what a home is for. It moved through generations the way warmth moves through stone, slowly, patiently, surrendering itself in increments until the material has been changed all the way through. A traveler came through the valley one autumn, many years after all of this. He was the kind of traveler who pays attention to what he sees and asks questions when he doesn't understand it, which is the best kind. He had been noticing, for the past day of riding, that the buildings in this part of the valley were different from the ones he knew. Set into hillsides, rather than on them, with small stone chimneys positioned away from the structures in a way that made no immediate sense, and windows that glowed with a warmth that seemed disproportionate to the modest scale of the fires visible inside. He stopped at the general store, which was run now by a man with steady eyes and organized shelves, and the particular competence of someone who has learned, at some cost, the difference between being useful and being needed. Owen Marsh listened to the traveler's question and then crossed to the far wall and lifted a glass case from a shelf. Inside was a book, leather-bound, the leather old and soft with handling, the pages dense with small angular handwriting and careful diagrams. He set it on the counter. "That will tell you what you want to know," Owen said. "It tells everyone what they want to know, if they're willing to read carefully." The traveler opened the journal to a random page and read, "The thermal mass of red sandstone at this formation depth will hold approximately 6 hours of stored heat per firing cycle under winter conditions. Grade the floor at 2 degrees. Water follows gravity, not hope." He turned to the last page. The handwriting there was the same, but the ink was older, the page softer, the words set down with the deliberateness of someone writing what they most want to be remembered. Stone does not fight the cold. It remembers the warmth. Build into the earth. Build with what the earth gives. And when the storm comes, and it will come, trust what you have built. Be the mountain. The traveler stood in the warm store for a long moment. He looked at Owen, who was watching him, with an expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else, but lived in the quiet territory between them. "Who built the first one?" the traveler asked. "The first house like this?" Owen considered the question with the care it deserved. He thought about a girl waist deep in a trench, her face striped with clay dust, not stopping when he and his friends came to watch. He thought about a chimney stack he had destroyed in the dark, and the silence with which she had received the knowledge of it. He thought about the warmth that had risen through his boots when he stood over the buried flue on that last night before the storm, and how he had known, even then, even with his pride still hot and his hands still stupid with whiskey, that what she was building was real. A girl, he said, 17 years old, in a winter that tried to kill everything in this valley. He paused. She didn't let it. The traveler closed the journal carefully and set it back on the counter. He stepped outside into the autumn cold. Above the valley, on the north-facing slope where the barrow sat in its permanent shadow, a thin thread of warmth rose from a small stone chimney, steady and constant, visible only if you knew to look for it, the evidence of a fire burning in the earth below, surrendering its heat to stone that would hold it long after the fire was gone. In the window of the door, set into the rock, a warm light glowed. It had been glowing for many years. It would continue to glow for many years more. The mountain held what it had been given, the way mountains hold everything. Without fuss, without fanfare, simply with the vast and patient constancy of something that has made a decision about what it is and has seen no reason to revise it. And if you are facing your own kind of cold right now, if the world has handed you a deed for worthless land and called it mercy, if the people who should have helped you have turned away, if you are standing at the entrance of something dark and uncertain and wondering whether you have what it takes, remember her. She was 17 years old. She had a dead man's journal and a pickaxe, and a boy who needed her, and a mother whose lungs were failing. She had nothing that the world considers power. She built, anyway, into the earth, with what she had, 1 inch at a time. The floor became the hearth. The stone remembered the warmth, and 40 feet of love, laid underground by a father who knew he was running out of time, kept his family alive long after he was gone. Be the mountain. The stone does not fight. It remembers.